Welcome, dear listeners, to a story that crosses time and touches the human soul in its purest essence. Today we will travel to Brazil in 1851, where two hearts wounded by life will find in the interior of Rio Grande do Sul a second chance for love and hope. Between vast fields and the perfume of flame trees, a young German woman and a widowed rancher will discover that sometimes one must lose everything to find what truly matters. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? What blessed land welcomes you at this moment? If this story touches your heart, as I hope it will, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave that loving like. It helps so much to bring these narratives to more people who, like you, seek stories that nourish the soul. Year 1851, village of Santa Cruz do Sul, interior of Rio Grande do Sul. The Minuano wind swept across the hills with the same melancholic insistence that dwelt in Antonio Pereira's chest. 45 years of life had carved deep marks on his face, the marks of one who had known both glory and desolation. The scar that cut across his left arm, a memory from the Farroupilha times, seemed small compared to the invisible wound that had torn his soul since August of the previous year. The estancia that had once bustled with life now echoed only with the creaking of old boards and the distant murmur of cattle. Rosa was gone, taken by cholera on a grey morning when the flame trees had not yet opened their pink flowers. 20 years of marriage, of intertwined hands, of laughter shared by the ground fire, all reduced now to the silence that weighed on the rancher's broad shoulders like a soaked poncho. Antonio walked through the empty rooms, his steps echoing on the canela preta boards that Rosa had so loved. The smell of sweet herb that she used to prepare on cold afternoons still seemed to float through the kitchen, an olfactory ghost that tortured and consoled him at the same time. His calloused hands trembled slightly when he reached for the bottle of cachaça that he kept always near, bitter company for bitter nights. Bayo, his Pampean horse with golden coat, watched him with that peculiar intelligence of animals who know their owners intimately. He seemed to understand that something fundamental had broken in the heart of this man, who had once been fearless on the battlefields of the Revolution, but who now let himself be consumed by longing like a paper boat in the current. The property, which stretched for leagues between the groves and the floodplains of the Pardinho River, had begun to wither under the neglect of an owner who had lost interest in life. The ranch hands worked with their usual dedication, but the attentive gaze was missing, the firm word, the presence that commanded with authority and affection. Donna Mariana, the healer who had come to assist Rosa in her last days, appeared from time to time with her herbs and prayers, trying to pull Antonio from the dark well into which he had sunk. Her words were soft as the song of the Uirapuru, but they could not penetrate the armor of pain he had built around his heart. The sun set behind distant hills, tinting the sky a melancholic pink that reminded him too much of the dress Rosa had worn on their wedding day. Antonio closed his eyes, feeling the weight of empty days accumulating like stones in his soul. He needed a decision, any direction that would take him from this place where every shadow whispered the name of his lost beloved. The wind brought with it the aroma of flowering pitanga trees and a sudden certainty. He could not continue like this. Something needed to change, even if it meant leaving behind everything he had known. But would it be possible to flee from one's own memories? May had arrived with its cool mornings, and Antonio's decision took shape, like the mist that rose from the floodplains at dawn. He would sell 2/3 of the estancia and buy a distant place where memories could not reach him. News of the sale spread through the village like fire in dry straw. The respected rancher Antonio Pereira was disposing of almost everything. Vicente Rodriguez, the village's prosperous merchant, had mentioned an abandoned ranch from years ago, lost among the groves 20 kilometers away, a place forgotten by men where only the wind and animals maintained some form of life. It was exactly what Antonio sought, a place to die while living, far from pitying looks and empty words of consolation. The transaction was quick, almost brutal in its simplicity. Money changed hands, papers were signed, and suddenly Antonio found himself owner of a piece of land that no one had visited for a decade. He kept only the essentials: Bayo, a cart pulled by 2 gentle oxen, some tools, clothes, provisions, and the bottle of cachaça that had become his silent confidant. The journey began on a clear morning, when dew still kissed the leaves of eucalyptus planted by Germans newly arrived in the region. Bayo trotted alongside the cart, his golden mane dancing in the wind, while the oxen advanced in the measured rhythm that had marked generations of gaucho drovers. Antonio did not look back when the estancia disappeared behind the hills. He carried in his chest a dull pain, but also a strange liberation, as if he were finally allowing himself to sink completely, without fighting against the current that dragged him away from everything he had known. The dirt road serpentined between native fields, where cattle from other ranches grazed peacefully under the blue immensity of the sky. The smell of moist earth and new grass filled his lungs, mixing with the strong aroma of oxen and the rhythmic creaking of cart wheels, sounds that calmed him in a primitive and familiar music. At the end of the afternoon, he spotted in the distance the dark patches of groves that hid his destination. The ranch was there, somewhere among those trees, waiting for him like a refuge or a grave, perhaps both. The sun began its slow descent behind the hills, painting everything in golden and melancholic tones. When he finally emerged from the narrow trail that cut through the woods, Antonio faced his new reality, a construction of cracked adobe, thatched roof rotting in some places, surrounded by a silence that seemed to have its own weight. It was perfect in its decadence, a place where a man could disappear from the world without leaving traces. He unloaded the cart while Bayo grazed peacefully, as if understanding that this would be their new home. Night approached rapidly, bringing with it the mysterious sounds of the woods, crickets, owls, the rustling of dry leaves under invisible paws. Antonio lit a fire in what remained of the clay stove and prepared his first mate in that place forgotten by God and men. The bitter herb went down his throat like a melancholic blessing, sealing his pact with solitude. But what he didn't know was that he was not alone in that place, where he had hoped to find only the silence of his own ghosts. Dawn brought with it a sound that should not exist in that place forgotten by the world, the weak cry of a child. Antonio awoke startled, the cachaza from the previous night still clouding his senses, certain that the ghosts of his own pain had begun to play tricks on him. But the crying persisted, coming from some hidden corner of the ranch. He put on his worn leather boots and walked cautiously through the ruined rooms, following the sound like a bloodhound follows a trail. That's when he saw her, a young woman with hair as light as ripe wheat, sitting in a corner of the abandoned kitchen, cradling two small children in her arms. Her dress, once blue, now showed faded and mended, and her light eyes reflected the fear of a cornered animal. She could not be more than 18 years old, but carrying two children alone had impressed on her face a precocious maturity. When she saw Antonio, she jumped up, instinctively protecting the little ones against her chest, murmuring words in German that he did not understand, but whose desperate tone needed no translation. "No, no hurt. Please," she stammered in broken Portuguese, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. Antonio instinctively stepped back, raising his hands in a universal gesture of peace. The young woman was clearly malnourished. Her once round cheeks now showed the mark of hunger, and the children's clothes, though clean, were worn to threads. "Calm down, miss," he said with the gentlest voice he could find. "I won't harm you." The twins, who could not be more than 6 months old, looked at him with that innocent curiosity of very small children. A boy and a girl, both with their mother's light hair and cheeks, that should have been rosier if not for the evident lack of adequate nutrition. Katerina, for that was her name, as he would discover later, watched his every movement with the attention of one who had learned to survive by reading intentions in others' gestures. There was in her a wounded but not broken dignity, like a flower that insists on sprouting between stones. "How did you come to be here?" asked Antonio, maintaining respectful distance. The answer came in fragments, mixing precarious Portuguese with German words, accompanied by gestures that painted a tragic picture. The arrival from Germany with her parents, their death from disease, abandonment by the German community when she became pregnant by a Brazilian drover who left without leaving even a name or a promise. A month hidden in that ranch, surviving on wild fruits and stream water, waiting, she didn't quite know for what. The morning sun entered through the cracks in the boards, creating golden stripes on the beaten earth floor. Antonio felt something move in his chest. It was not just compassion, but a strange familiarity with the desperation he read in the young woman's clear eyes. Both were fugitives from life, refugees in places where pain could not find them. "Are you hungry?" he asked. And the way her eyes lit up was answer enough. He prepared jerky with beans in the iron pot he had brought, while she remained seated, rocking the children and murmuring German songs in a low voice. The music was melancholic and beautiful, strangely familiar despite the incomprehensible words. Rosa had also sung to the child they lost in infancy, songs in Portuguese that had the same infinite tenderness. When he offered the steaming plate, Catarina hesitated only an instant before accepting with a whispered, "Danke." She ate with the delicacy of one who doesn't want to seem desperate, though it was evident she was famished. The twins nursed eagerly when she breastfed them, and Antonio looked away out of modesty, pretending to examine the cracks in the wall. The day advanced in comfortable silences and sparse words. He arranged a more protected corner for her to settle with the children, while thinking about what this situation meant for his plans of complete isolation. At evening, when she rocked the little ones to sleep singing softly, Antonio felt a pang in his chest, not of pain as he was accustomed, but of something he could not name. How could two lost souls find each other precisely in the place where they had come to hide from the world? The days that followed flowed like calm water, marked by a silent routine that neither had dared propose, but which had established itself naturally. Antonio woke with the first song of the Bemtevis and prepared mate in the gourd calabash inherited from his father, while Catarina cared for the twins with the serene efficiency of one who had learned to do much with little. She observed his gestures with the attention of a scholar, absorbing gaucho customs like a sponge absorbs rain. The way he held the bombilla, the ritual of preparing the herb, the respectful form of offering the first sip, everything was new to a young woman raised among German habits of coffee and dark bread. Chimarrão, she repeated, savoring the word as she savored the bitter drink. Is good. Antonio hid a smile when she mixed the two languages, creating a strange and moving music. In exchange, she taught him words in German, pointing to objects and repeating patiently until he could pronounce something close to correct. Kinder, she said, showing the twins. Children. Kinder, he repeated, and Hans babbled something that sounded like approval, while Greta observed everything with her very serious blue eyes. During the day, Antonio worked on restoring the ranch, fixing loose boards, sealing cracks, redoing parts of the roof. His calloused hands found comfort in the work, in practical action that did not require confrontation with the ghosts of memory. Catarina helped where she could, always with one child in her arms and another playing at her feet. She was skillful with needle and thread, mending his clothes with almost religious care, as if each stitch were a silent prayer of gratitude. When she found a piece of blue fabric among the belongings abandoned in the ranch, she spent hours transforming it into a little outfit for Greta, humming softly while she sewed. The nights were the most delicate moment. They sat around the ground fire, drinking cachaça in small controlled sips, she nursing one of the children or simply watching the flames dance. Few words were exchanged, but there was a growing understanding between them, as if they were veterans of the same silent war. One afternoon, when rain began to fall in thick drops on the mended roof, Catarina began to speak, not in fragments as before, but in a measured narrative, mixing Portuguese and German, telling about the journey from Germany, about parents who died of typhus in the first winter, about the loneliness of being a foreigner in a land that did not want her. Antonio listened while braiding a leather rope, his fingers working automatically, while his mind processed each word. When she mentioned the drover who had abandoned her pregnant, he saw her hands tremble slightly, and he wanted to say that not all men were like that, but the words did not come. The next day he found her washing clothes in the stream that ran behind the ranch, the twins sleeping in a basket lined with soft grass. She sang a German song, her clear voice echoing among the trees, and for a moment he allowed himself to stand still, just listening. It was the first music he had heard since Rosa's death, and it didn't hurt as much as he had expected. "It's beautiful, the song," he said when she noticed his presence. "My mother sang it to me," she replied, blushing slightly. "It speaks of Heimat, of home." "And where is home for you now?" The question came out without him thinking, and both fell silent, contemplating the meaning of those words. Home, for two voluntary exiles from life, who had found each other in the place where they least expected to find someone. Catarina folded one of his shirts with excessive care, as if the clothing were made of glass. "Nicht weiß, I don't know," she finally whispered. That night, Antonio stayed awake longer than usual, listening to the gentle breathing of the three people who shared that precarious roof. For the first time in months, the cachaça remained untouched at his side. What did it mean when the flight from solitude began to seem less attractive than unexpected company? The news reached the village carried by the mountain wind and the sharp tongue of Donna Mariana, who had come to the ranch to gather medicinal herbs and found much more than she expected. The healer, with her perspicacious eyes that had witnessed half a century of human dramas, observed the domestic scene with the attention of one who knows how to read between the lines. Antonio preparing mate for a young German woman holding two blonde babies. The respectful intimacy between them, the way he spoke low so as not to wake the children, how she folded his clothes with wifely care. Donna Mariana was not a woman to judge hastily, but she was also not blind. In 3 days the story had spread through the village like fire in dry grass. Father Francisco, Portuguese by birth and conservative by conviction, declared from the pulpit that it was scandal and perdition for a Christian man to live in sin with a German heretic. Vicente Rodriguez, always political, commented in corners that these mixtures came to no good. But it was in the German community that the storm really broke. Herr Klaus Schneider, respected leader of the immigrants, convened a meeting at his house to discuss the Katharina problem. The young woman had been expelled months before for becoming pregnant out of wedlock, an unforgivable sin in a community that struggled to preserve its traditions in a strange land. "Sie ist eine Schande," thundered Schneider to the men gathered in his room. "She is a shame to all of us Germans." The German women, who had once been Katharina's friends, now whispered among themselves that she had lowered herself to live with a Brazilian, confirming all prejudices about the moral decadence that Brazil represented to their hearts nostalgic for the distant homeland. At the ranch, Katharina felt the weight of those invisible stares like stones on her shoulders. She had grown up hearing that Brazilians were lazy and uncivilized, while now the Germans saw her as a traitor to her own race. She was suspended between two worlds that rejected her, carrying children who would never completely belong to either. Antonio perceived her growing sadness, the way she looked toward distant hills with eyes full of contained tears. One afternoon, when rain kept them trapped inside the ranch, he asked directly, "What afflicts you, Katharina?" She took time to answer, nursing Greta while Hans slept in the improvised cradle that Antonio had made with wood and braided leather. "I have no place, nicht gehöre, I don't belong," she finally said. "Germans don't want me, Brazilians don't want me. My children, what will they be?" The pain in her voice touched something deep in Antonio's chest. He knew the sensation of not belonging. After Rosa's death, he felt like a foreigner in his own life. But Katharina carried an even greater burden. She was a foreigner in two homelands at the same time. "Brazilians are not all the same," he said, choosing words carefully. "Some judge without knowing, others recognize quality where it exists." The following Sunday, Father Francisco appeared at the ranch mounted on a pampa mare, his black cassock contrasting with the green of the fields. He came fulfilling what he considered his pastoral duty, to save Antonio's soul and drive away the German temptation from his path. "Antonio, my son," said the priest, accepting the offered mate but casting disapproving glances at Katharina, who withdrew discreetly with the children. "You are losing yourself on a dangerous path. Father, with all respect, I am giving shelter to a needy mother and her children." "Shelter," the priest smiled sadly. "Everyone sees how you live. It is scandal, Antonio. And this girl, she is not of our faith, not of our race. Think of Rosa's soul, which rests with our Lord." The mention of Rosa's name made Antonio clench his fists, but he kept his voice controlled. Rosa had a generous heart. She would not condemn a helpless mother. The priest left without achieving the change he expected, but leaving seeds of doubt that germinated during the following days. Antonio observed Katharina with the village's eyes, saw how she would be judged, how her children would grow up marked by prejudice. It was then that the decision began to form in his mind, slow as dawn, but inevitable as sunrise. Could there be a way to protect that unlikely family from the judgment of two worlds? The proposal was born on a June morning, when frost covered the fields like white lace and vapor rose from Bayo's nostrils as he grazed peacefully. Antonio watched Katharina teach Hans to take his first stumbling steps across the beaten earth floor, while Greta followed every movement with eyes too attentive for a child of few months. The young German woman had flourished in recent months. Her face had regained healthy colors, and her golden hair shone like wheat in the sun. More than that, there was in her a serenity that had not existed when he found her, as if constant work and predictable routine had healed invisible wounds. "Katharina," he said that morning, the words coming out more formal than usual. "I need to speak with you." She raised her eyes, always attentive to changes in tone of voice, to signs that might announce a new storm in her life. Hans chose that moment to fall sitting down, laughing with the unconscious joy of the very young. "The people in the village talk," continued Antonio, turning the mate gourd between his hands. "They talk about us, about how we live here." Her face paled instantly. "You want me to leave?" she said, and it was not a question. "No," the answer came quickly, surprising them both. "I don't want you to leave, but I also cannot let you and the children suffer because of malicious tongues." Katerina lowered her eyes, concentrating excessively on cleaning her hands on the faded apron. "Then what? Marry me." The words hung in the air like vapor from the mate, loaded with meanings that neither dared examine too closely. Katerina slowly raised her face, her blue eyes studying every line of his expression, as if trying to decipher a foreign language. "Why?" she finally asked. It was a fair question that deserved an honest answer. Antonio reflected on the motivations that had brought him to that moment. Protection, companionship, something more that he could not name. To give the children a name, so that you have a place in the village, so that no one can say you live in sin. And you? What do you gain? Antonio took time to answer, watching Hans try once more to balance standing, determined as only children know how to be. "I don't know," he said finally, and there was brutal honesty in that confession. Perhaps it's not good for anyone to live alone too much." Katerina remained silent for a long time, rocking Greta, who had begun to whimper. When she spoke, her voice was low as a whisper. "I cannot give wifely love. Noch nicht. Not yet. I'm not asking for love," he replied. "I'm offering respect, protection, an honored name. And if later you want more, then we'll talk when the time comes." The simplicity of the answer seemed to calm her. She nodded slowly, like one accepting a contract whose terms are clear, even though the future remains uncertain. 3 weeks later, on a sunny July morning, Father Francisco was celebrating a reluctant wedding in his small stone chapel. Antonio wore his best clothes, a dark suit that smelled of lavender and cinnamon. Katerina wore a simple blue linen dress that Donna Mariana had sewn especially for the occasion, a bouquet of wildflowers in her trembling hands. Hans and Greta, clean and dressed like little princes, were held by a German neighbor who had come more out of curiosity than approval. The German community had sent only one representative, Herr Müller, father of a large family who considered the marriage a Christian solution to a worldly problem. The ceremony was bilingual by necessity and very brief by mutual desire. When the priest declared them husband and wife, Antonio kissed Katerina's forehead with respectful tenderness, sealing a pact that was more a survival alliance than a union of passion. That night, at their first dinner as an officially constituted family, Antonio legally adopted Hans and Greta, giving them the Pereira surname and a definitive place in the world. But would it be possible for a marriage of convenience to transform into something deeper, or would they be condemned to live as polite strangers under the same roof? The first months of marriage passed in the delicacy of two people learning to share not just space but the small rituals that make a house a home. Katerina, now Katerina Pereira, moved through the house with the caution of one still testing the ground beneath her feet, while Antonio respected her hesitations like a tamer respects a wounded animal that needs time to trust. She slept in the smaller room with the children, he in the main room that he had once shared with Rosa. There was no rush for changes. Both had learned that time heals wounds that force can only open further. Katerina revealed herself to be a woman of surprising talents. Her delicate hands knew how to transform simple ingredients into meals that filled the house with aromas that awakened even memories that Antonio thought lost. The bread she baked on weekends had a golden crust and fluffy crumb that melted in the mouth, a technique learned from her mother on cold German mornings. Hans grew strong like a young colt, exploring every corner of the ranch with the infinite curiosity of healthy boys. Greta, more observant, preferred to stay close to her mother, studying the world with blue eyes that seemed to see more than age allowed. It was on a September afternoon when the flame trees began to open their pink flowers that something changed between Antonio and Katerina. He had returned from the village with high fevers after getting soaked in an unexpected storm, and she cared for him with devotion that went beyond a wife's obligation. Cold compresses on his forehead, herbal teas that Donna Mariana had taught her, nightly vigil when delirium made him call Rosa's name. Katerina showed no jealousy of the ghosts of the past. She only held his hand when he trembled and hummed German songs that calmed him, without him knowing why. When the fever finally broke, he found her sleeping in the chair beside the bed, one hand still resting on his. In that moment, looking at the serene face of the young woman who had chosen to stay by his side, even when he was delirious with memories of another woman, Antonio felt something move in his chest. It was no longer gratitude or compassion, but something warmer, more intimate. 4 months later, on a January morning, when the heat already announced the coming summer, Katerina appeared in the kitchen with a special flush on her cheeks and news that would change everything. I'm expecting a baby, she said, her voice mixing anxiety and joy. Antonio, who was peeling a bergamot with the tip of his knife, stopped with the gesture suspended in air. It was the first time they would become parents together, not by chance or circumstance, but by mutual choice, by love that had grown slowly, like a well-tended plant. "Are you sure?" he asked, and when she nodded, he dropped the fruit and walked to her, taking her hands in his. "How do you feel?" "Happy," she said simply, "and afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of not knowing how to be a Brazilian mother to a Brazilian child." Antonio smiled, the first true smile she had seen illuminate his face since they met. "You don't need to be Brazilian. You need to be you. And you are a good mother. Hans and Greta are proof of that." Joachim was born on a September morning, when the first flowers of spring appeared in the fields. He was a robust baby, with dark hair like his father, and eyes that promised to have the color of autumn skies. Antonio held his son in trembling arms, feeling the tiny weight of that life that was a continuation of his own. Hans and Greta, now over a year old, watched the new brother with the respectful curiosity of children who instinctively understand the importance of sacred moments. Katerina, exhausted but radiant, watched the scene from her bed, seeing the family she had dreamed of take shape before her eyes. 2 years later came Rosa, a tribute to the first wife that had been accepted by Katerina with generosity that surprised even Antonio. "She made you the man I found," she had said simply when he hesitated to propose the name. Rosa was born on an afternoon of gentle rain, with golden hair like her mother, and a sweet temperament that won everyone's heart from her first cry. Anna, the youngest, would arrive 3 years later, completing the family with her contagious joy and precocious talent for music. But would it be possible for happiness to last, or did the past still hold secrets capable of shaking the peace built with such care? The ranch had transformed over the years, like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly, slowly, but so completely that those who had known its previous version could barely recognize it. Where once there had been cracked adobe, now rose solid walls of stone and lime. The thatched roof had been replaced by red tiles that Antonio had bought from a German potter, creating a style that mixed Luso-Brazilian traditions with Germanic solidity. Katerina had brought with her agricultural techniques that multiplied the land's productivity. The gardens, organized in precise rows, produced vegetables that didn't even exist on the traditional gaucho table: purple cabbage, radishes, sweet beets that she preserved in clay pots for winter. The orchard she had planted grew vigorously, promising apples and pears that would ease the longing for the distant homeland. The property prospered not just in products, but in harmony. Antonio had learned enough German words to sing lullabies to the children, while Katerina mastered Portuguese with an accent that melted the most hardened hearts in the village. The children grew up trilingual effortlessly, Portuguese with their father, German with their mother, and the universal language of affection that they all spoke together. Hans, at 6 years old, had revealed a vocation for working with metal that impressed even the experienced blacksmiths of the village. His little hands could already model simple objects in hot iron, combining German techniques that his mother had taught him with gaucho ways he had learned by watching Antonio. Greta preferred books, rare and precious, that Antonio bought when he went to Porto Alegre, devouring stories in Portuguese and German with equal voracity. Joachim, at 3 years old, showed signs of having inherited his father's ability with horses and cattle. He rode a gentle pony, as if he had been born attached to the animal's back, and could already distinguish pregnancy in mares by observing only their posture. Rosa, still a baby, enchanted everyone with crystalline laughter that echoed through the house like the music of bells. On an autumn afternoon, when the leaves of the plane trees yellowed, and the air had that golden quality that makes time seem suspended, Father Francisco appeared for a visit that everyone knew was an official surrender. The Portuguese, who had fought so hard against that marriage, could not deny the evidence before his eyes: prosperous family, educated children, property that was an example of work and union. "Katerina," he said, accepting the cup of coffee she offered him, I must confess I was wrong about this marriage. She smiled with the gentleness she had learned to cultivate even in the face of hostility. Father Francisco, we all make mistakes sometimes. What's important is to recognize and move forward. Do you unforgive my harsh words? They were forgiven long ago. The priest observed Hans playing with his little iron tools in the yard, Greta reading aloud to Joachim, Rosa crawling after a lazy cat. God writes straight on crooked lines, he murmured. This family and is a blessing, not a curse. The change in the priest's attitude echoed through the village like waves on a lake. If the religious leader blessed that union, who were the others to continue judging? Gradually, the Pereira family came to be accepted not just as exotic curiosity, but as a natural part of the community. The German community took longer to surrender to the evidence, but even Herr Schneider had to admit that Katharina had not brought dishonor to the German name. On the contrary, she had shown that it was possible to preserve traditions even far from the homeland, adapting without losing essence. One night after the children slept and they sat on the porch to observe the stars, Katharina rested her head on Antonio's shoulder with a naturalness that no longer surprised them. "Are you happy?" she asked. "More than I thought it would be possible to be again," he replied, putting his arm around her shoulders. "And you?" "I have Heimat now," she said. "True home, not the place where I was born, but the place where I chose to stay." "And the children? How will it be for them growing up between two cultures?" Katharina smiled in the darkness. "They will have the best of both worlds. German strength and gaucho heart, discipline and passion. They will be citizens of the world. But would it be possible for such happiness to last forever, or did life still hold challenges capable of testing the solidity of that family built on such improbable foundations? 20 years passed like calm water from the Pardinho River, carrying away childhood and bringing youth full of promises. The ranch had transformed into a prosperous property that served as a model for other ranches in the region. But more than that, it had become a symbol that it was possible to unite different traditions without losing the essence of either. Hans, at 21 years old, had established his forge near the main house where he created tools that combined German precision with the resistance required by gaucho work. His hands, which had once been tiny molding clay, now dominated iron like a musician dominates his instrument. He had married Helga, daughter of German immigrants from the second wave, in a ceremony that celebrated both Germanic traditions and gaucho customs. Greta had flourished into a young woman of serene beauty and sharp intelligence who spoke 4 languages, Portuguese, German, French, and Latin, and taught the village children in a makeshift school in the old barn. Her classes were sought after by German and Brazilian families, who recognized in the young teacher the rare capacity to teach while preserving each student's origins. Joachim, at 18 years old, had revealed himself to be a born rancher, with a keen eye for cattle and diplomatic skill that made him mediate disputes between neighbors with wisdom that impressed men twice his age. He had inherited his father's honesty and his mother's patience, a combination that made him respected throughout the region. Rosa, at 15 years old, surprised everyone with her passion for healing wounds and diseases. She accompanied Donna Mariana on her visits, absorbing knowledge about medicinal herbs and childbirth, with dedication that scandalized some conservative families. "Women shouldn't meddle with such things," grumbled the more traditional, but Rosa followed her path with determination that reminded them of her mother. Anna, the youngest at 12 years old, filled the house with music from her small accordion that Antonio had bought on a trip to Porto Alegre. Her compositions mixed German melodies with gaucho rhythms, creating new music that made old people cry with longing for lands they had never known. On a spring afternoon, when peach blossoms filled the air with sweet perfume, the family gathered on the porch to celebrate another wedding anniversary of Antonio and Katharina. 20 years of union that had begun as convenience and flowered into love as deep as roots that intertwine underground. "Tell us how you met," asked Anna, who loved love stories. Antonio and Katharina exchanged complicit glances, remembering the distant morning when he had found a frightened young woman hiding with 2 babies in an abandoned ranch. "Your father saved me," said Katharina simply, "and perhaps I saved him too." "How so, mother?" asked Rosa, always curious about human motivations. "Sometimes 2 broken people can heal each other," explained Antonio. "Your mother taught me it was possible to love again. I gave her a place in the world." Hans, now father of 2 small children, watched his parents with admiration that did not diminish with age. You taught us that family is not just blood. It's choice, it's care, it's staying together, even when it's difficult. Greta, always the most philosophical, added, and that different cultures can mix without either being lost. We are German and Brazilian at the same time, and that makes us richer, not poorer. Joachim, practical as always, laughed, and that honest work and mutual respect build more than beautiful speeches. Rosa, always concerned with justice, said, you proved that prejudice is a thing of small people. True love sees neither skin color nor origin. Anna, the family artist, summed up with poetry in her voice. You made music where there was only silence. When the children retired to their evening activities, Antonio and Caterina were left alone on the porch, watching the stars that shone over their prosperous property and united family. Sometimes I think of the frightened young woman I found in that ruined ranch, said Antonio. It seems like another life. And I think of the sad man who drank to forget, replied Caterina. It also seems like another life. Do you miss Germany? I miss my mother, the smell of the bread she made, said Caterina, honest as always. But home is not where we are born. It's where we choose to stay, where we create our roots. But even families solid as rocks face storms, and a final test still awaited to test the strength of the bonds they had built together. The year 1871 brought with it winds of change that blew not only over the fields of Rio Grande do Sul, but over the entire country. Brazil was changing, modernizing, and echoes of these transformations reached the Pereira ranch carried by the conversations of drovers and the letters that Greta read aloud on winter nights. Slavery was slowly dying, creating social tensions that were reflected in the heated discussions of the village. Some traditional ranchers saw in the Pereira family a dangerous example of mixing that could encourage other confusions in the established social order. They whispered that accepting Germans in the community was the first step to accepting other undesirable changes. It was on one of those afternoons, charged with tension, that an unexpected visitor arrived at the ranch, a tall man with red beard and green eyes, who introduced himself as Wilhelm Hoffmann, Katharina's cousin who had come from Germany looking for her. Ich habe dich lange gesucht, Katharina, he said in German, completely ignoring Antonio. I have been looking for you for a long time. Katharina paled upon recognizing him. Wilhelm was the son of her father's brother, a prosperous man who had emigrated to Brazil with enough capital to buy land and establish himself as a farmer in the interior of São Paulo. He had come to fetch his cousin to save her from the life he judged unworthy of a woman of German blood. My family is here, replied Caterina in Portuguese deliberately. These are my children, this is my husband. Wilhelm observed the children with a critical gaze that did not hide his contempt. Halb Blut, he murmured. Mixed blood. They are not true Germans. The word hit Hans like a slap. At 21 years old, the young blacksmith had grown up proud of his two origins, but now saw himself reduced to half-blood by a relative he didn't even know. Greta, always diplomatic, tried to ease the tension by offering coffee to the visitor, but he refused with a disdainful gesture. I come to offer new life, said Wilhelm, addressing exclusively Caterina. I bought a prosperous farm in São Paulo. You can take the children, give them proper German education away from this mixture. And my husband? Asked Caterina, her voice dangerously controlled. This man... Wilhelm didn't even look at Antonio. He is not appropriate for a German woman. You can begin again with dignity. The silence that followed had physical weight. Antonio felt 20 years of secret insecurities resurge like poorly buried ghosts. Was Caterina really happy or just resigned? Didn't she still dream of life among her own people, away from the prejudices she faced daily? Caterina rose slowly, assuming the regal posture she took in moments of important decision. When she spoke, her voice echoed clear as a church bell. Wilhelm, you traveled far to find me, and I acknowledge that, but you arrived 20 years too late. She walked to Antonio, took his hand, and continued, This man gave me a name when I had none. He gave me family when I was alone. He gave me respect when the world despised me. My children, and her voice rose to emphasize the word, all my children are fruits of true love, whether by blood or by choice. Hans stepped forward, followed by Greta, Joachim, Rosa, and Anna. United, they formed a protective barrier around their parents. We are family, said Greta simply, complete and true. Wilhelm looked at the united group, recognizing that his mission had failed before it even began. He said goodbye coldly, leaving with the certainty that his cousin was lost forever in the barbarous lands of Brazil. That night, When the children finally retired after long discussions about identity and belonging, Antonio found Caterina sitting on the porch, looking at the stars with a thoughtful expression. "Did you have doubts today?" he asked, sitting beside her. "Not about us," she replied, "but I thought about how it would be if I had accepted. Wilhelm represents financial security, social status among Germans, and it would be a golden prison. Here I am, a complete woman, wife, mother, German, Brazilian, free to be all these things at the same time." Antonio took her hand, feeling the calluses that 20 years of work had created, hands that told a story of choices and dedication. "You never spoke about regrets." "Because I have none," she said, turning to face him. "You gave me the richest life I could imagine. Our children are our masterpiece, our proof that true love knows no boundaries." But there was still one last test, a final moment that would test not just the love between them, but the strength of the foundations they had built for their extraordinary family. The summer of 1872 arrived with torrential rains that transformed the fields into swamps and rivers into furious torrents. The Pardinho River, which normally flowed gently near the ranch, rose beyond all known marks, threatening to carry away decades of work and prosperity. But it was not water that brought the greatest storm to the Pereira family. It was a sealed letter, with an official seal that arrived in the trembling hands of the village postman. Antonio opened it with fingers that already sensed bad news, reading in silence while his face progressively paled. "What is it?" asked Caterina, observing the transformation in her husband's expression. "Problems with the land deed," he said, his voice hoarse. "It seems the man who sold me the ranch was not the true owner." The letter was from a lawyer in Porto Alegre, representing the legitimate heirs of the property, a family living in the capital who had only now discovered that their lands had been fraudulently sold by a distant relative who had no rights over them. They demanded immediate return of the property or payment of compensation, equivalent to 3 times the value that Antonio had originally paid. It was an impossible sum for a rancher, even a prosperous one. The alternative was legal eviction and the loss of everything they had built together. Hans was the first to speak after Antonio read the letter aloud to the entire family gathered in the living room. "We'll fight. 20 years of honest work must be worth something before the law." "With what money?" asked Greta, always practical. "Lawyers are expensive, and they have more resources than we do." Joachim, who had inherited his father's sense of justice, clenched his fists. "It's not fair. We bought in good faith, improved the land, created a family here." Rosa, now 16 years old with precocious maturity, observed, "Perhaps we can get community support. We are respected here." Anna, the youngest, began to cry silently. It was the only home she had known, and the idea of losing it was impossible to process. Caterina remained quiet for a long time, her eyes fixed on her hands folded in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice had the serenity of one who had found peace even in the face of the storm. "We lost everything once and survived. If necessary, we'll do it again." "You speak of starting over as if it were simple," said Antonio, bitterness coloring his voice. "We're not young anymore, Caterina. I don't have 20 more years to rebuild a life." "But we have something we didn't have before," she replied. "We have each other, true family. No one can take that from us with a lawyer's paper." In the days that followed, news spread through the village like fire in dry grass. Reactions were varied. Some neighbors offered sincere help. Others showed the petty satisfaction of those who enjoy seeing the prosperous fall. Father Francisco appeared on a rainy afternoon, bringing more than words of comfort. "The parish can lend some money," he offered. "Not much, but perhaps enough to hire a decent lawyer." Vicente Rodriguez, the merchant, surprised everyone by offering to buy part of the cattle at a fair price, even knowing that Antonio was in a disadvantageous negotiating position. But it was Herr Schneider, the former opponent of the marriage, who brought the most unexpected proposal. He appeared one evening with other leaders of the German community, bringing a formal proposal. "We know you face difficulties," he said, speaking in careful Portuguese. "Caterina has always been a daughter of this land, even when we erred in rejecting her. We want to help." The German community offered not just money, but something more valuable, to unite with the Brazilian community in a show of strength that would impress any tribunal. Germans and Brazilians together, defending a family that represented the best of both cultures. That night, after the visitors left and the children retired, Antonio found Caterina in the kitchen, preparing bread for the next day, as if nothing had changed. "How can you be so calm?" he asked. "Because I learned that home is not a place," she replied, kneading the dough with rhythmic movements. "It's people. You can take our house, but you cannot take our family. And if we lose everything anyway?" Katerina stopped working, cleaned her hands on her apron, and looked at him with love that had matured through 2 decades of shared joys and sorrows. "Then we'll start again, together. And it will be even more beautiful, because we'll know exactly what's worth preserving." Would this serenity be enough to face the legal battle that was approaching, or were there still surprises hidden in the destiny of this family that had learned to transform adversities into victories? The legal battle that announced itself as a devastating storm transformed into a demonstration of community strength that surprised even the capital's lawyers. When the Porto Alegre tribunal convened to judge the Pereira family case, it found not just a rancher defending his property, but 2 entire communities, German and Brazilian, united in a common cause. Father Francisco had mobilized his influences in the church, obtaining letters of recommendation from bishops and religious authorities that attested to the family's exemplary character. Herr Schneider led a campaign among the Germans that resulted in a petition signed by all Germanic families in the region, declaring Katerina an honored daughter of the community. Hans, with his blacksmith skills, crafted symbolic gifts, silver horseshoes, for each member of the judging commission, accompanied by letters that Greta wrote in impeccable Portuguese, telling the family's story in terms that touched the most hardened hearts. Joachim organized the neighboring ranchers, who testified about the improvements made to the property and the value added to the region by the Pereira family's presence. Rosa collected testimonies from all the people who had been helped by Katerina during difficult births or serious illnesses, proving that she was much more than a resident. She was a pillar of the community. Anna, with her 12 years and musical talent, composed a song that blended German and Brazilian melodies, singing it in the tribunal with a crystalline voice that made men hardened by law discreetly wipe their eyes. Antonio himself surprised everyone with his eloquence in the tribunal. The man who had once fled from life to hide in an abandoned ranch now spoke with passion about justice, about family, about the right of those who work honestly to live in peace. "Honorable judges," he said, his voice echoing through the packed courtroom, "I am not here asking for charity. I am demanding justice. I bought that land in good faith, paid a fair price, transformed unproductive soil into prosperous property. More than that, I created there a family that is an example that it is possible to unite different cultures without losing the best of each." Katerina, called to testify, spoke in fluent Portuguese, but maintained the German accent that had become familiar music to the village's ears. "I came to Brazil as a refugee, alone and desperate. I found not just shelter, but true love and the opportunity to build a dignified life. This land gave me family, identity, purpose. I cannot imagine existing away from here." The heir's lawyer, an experienced man accustomed to simple land dispute cases, found himself facing something completely new. A family defended by an entire community, Brazilians and Germans united in a cause that transcended legal questions to touch fundamental issues of justice and humanity. When the documents were finally examined by experts, it was discovered that the original seller had forged not just the sale to Antonio, but several other fraudulent transactions. The true heirs, confronted with evidence of decades of property improvements and pressured by public opinion that had manifested massively in favor of the Pereira family, accepted an agreement that allowed them to remain upon symbolic payment. News of the victory reached the ranch on a golden autumn afternoon, brought by a messenger who rode 3 hours to personally deliver the judicial decision. The family was gathered on the porch when they learned they could stay, that 20 years of work had not been in vain. There were no shouts of joy or exuberant celebrations, just silent embraces and tears of relief that spoke louder than words. Anna played her song on the accordion while the sun set, tinting the sky in golden tones that reflected the finally reconquered peace. That night, after the children retired, Antonio and Katerina walked through the fields they had almost lost, breathing air perfumed by the orange blossoms she had planted years before. "Was all this struggle worth it?" he asked. "It was worth it because we discovered we are not alone," she replied. "We built not just family, but community. That is patrimony that no tribunal can take away. And now? Now we continue living," said Katerina simply, "growing old together, watching the children grow, the grandchildren arrive, making this land not just property but legacy." But there was still one final discovery, a revelation that would give complete meaning to the extraordinary journey they had traveled together. 22 years after that first encounter in the abandoned ranch, Antonio and Caterina found themselves on a spring morning, contemplating the property that stretched as far as the eye could see. He, at 67 years old, maintained an erect posture despite his completely white hair. She, at 40, radiated the serenity of one who had found her place in the world and there created deep roots. The main house had transformed into an imposing construction, surrounded by gardens where German flowers coexisted harmoniously with native plants. What had begun as precarious shelter for two fugitives from life had become the nucleus of a prosperous family that now counted married children and grandchildren who played through the corridors speaking Portuguese and German with equal fluency. It was on that golden morning that Caterina made a revelation she had guarded in her heart for more than 2 decades. "Antonio, I need to tell you something I never said." He looked at her with curiosity, mixed with a stab of apprehension. After so many years together, what secret could still exist between them? "When you found me that first day," she continued, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the hills met the sky, "it was not by chance that I was here." "What do you mean?" Caterina took a deep breath, as if she were about to rid herself of a weight carried for an entire lifetime. "I knew who you were before we arrived at the ranch. Donna Mariana had told me about the widowed rancher who had sold his lands and left to hide from the world. I came looking specifically for you." Antonio felt the world spin slightly around him. The woman he thought he had saved by chance had, in truth, deliberately sought him out. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Because I was also running away," she replied, finally looking into his eyes. "Not just from the rejection of the communities, but from the fear of facing life alone. Donna Mariana said you were a good man, that you had treated your first wife with love and respect. I thought that perhaps a man who knew how to love once could teach another person to trust again." The words fell between them like seeds in soil that had waited decades to receive them. Antonio slowly processed the meaning of that confession. Caterina had not been a victim of circumstances, but the protagonist of her own salvation. "You planned everything?" "I didn't plan for us to fall in love," she said quickly. "I only planned to survive. I thought of a marriage of convenience, of protection for my children. I never imagined I would find true love. And if I hadn't been interested in you, then I would have left after a few days and tried something else," she replied with brutal honesty. "But you were better than I expected, more gentle, more generous. You didn't just save my body from hunger, you saved my soul from bitterness." Antonio walked to the fence where Bayo, now old and retired, grazed peacefully under the shade of fruit trees. He needed time to absorb that revelation that completely changed his understanding of their first months together. "Do you feel betrayed?" asked Caterina, her voice small like a child's who fears punishment. He took time to answer, reviewing in his mind each moment of those first days, the way she observed his gestures, how she quickly learned his habits, how she had adapted with surprising ease to Gaucho life. "No," he finally said, turning to face her. "I feel honored." "Honored? You chose me," he explained, walking back to her side. "Among all the men you could have sought, you chose the broken rancher who drank to forget. You saw something in me that I couldn't see myself. I saw a man capable of love," she said simply, "and I was right." "And I saw a lost woman who needed salvation," he replied, taking her hands in his. "I was wrong. You never needed to be saved. You just needed a partner to build a new life." They remained in silence for some minutes, absorbing the weight of that revelation that, instead of shaking the foundations of their union, only solidified them further. They had built true love on bases of mutual need and conscious choice, perhaps the most solid foundation possible for any marriage. "Do the children know?" asked Antonio. "No one knows besides Donna Mariana and now you. Why did you choose to tell me today?" Caterina smiled, and in that smile he saw the 18-year-old girl who had once arrived at the ranch carrying 2 babies and an uncertain future. "Because today we complete 22 years together, and I realized I don't want any more secrets between us. You deserve to know you were chosen, not just found." Would this revelation be the apex of their journey, or was there still one last surprise hidden in destiny's plans for this extraordinary family? The year 1873 brought with it the serenity of fruits harvested after decades of careful planting. Antonio, at 68 years old, observed from the porch the constant movement of his property. No longer the abandoned ranch of other times, but a prosperous complex that included the main house, the married children's residences, workshops, stables, and cultivated fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. Hans had become the most respected blacksmith in the region, his creations sought after by ranchers from 3 provinces. He had married Helga and given the couple 3 grandchildren, Klaus, Maria, and little Antonio, who at 2 years old already showed fascination with his father's forges. Greta had established a formal school in a building of her own within the property, where she taught children of Germans and Brazilians in bilingual education that served as a model for other communities. She had remained single by choice, declaring that her students were her family. Joachim had gradually assumed administration of the estancia, modernizing breeding and agricultural techniques under his father's respectful guidance. He had married Sophia, daughter of a traditional rancher, in a union that further consolidated the family's position in local society. Rosa, now 19 years old, had shocked conservative society by announcing her intention to study medicine in the capital. Antonio and Caterina supported her decision, even facing criticism from those who considered it inappropriate for a young lady to follow such a profession. Anna, at 15 years old, composed music that was sung throughout the village, her melodies capturing the hybrid soul of a generation that had grown up between 2 cultures and made that duality their greatest strength. On a golden autumn afternoon, when the leaves of the plane trees painted the ground yellow and red, the family gathered to celebrate another wedding anniversary of Antonio and Caterina. 22 years of union that had begun as convenience and flowered into the deepest love any of them could imagine. The grandchildren played in the yard, their voices mixing Portuguese and German in natural music that made the grandparents smile with tenderness. It was the 3rd generation of the family, children who grew up without knowing prejudices, for whom the mixture of cultures was as natural as breathing. "Tell us about the first meeting," asked Klaus, an 8-year-old grandson who loved his grandparents' stories. Antonio and Caterina exchanged complicit glances. After Caterina's revelation the previous year, they had decided to keep to themselves the most intimate details of how they met, preserving for their children and grandchildren a version that emphasized destiny and divine providence. "Your grandfather found me when I needed it most," said Caterina, smiling at the little ones who surrounded her. "And I found him when he needed to remember that life could still be beautiful." 2 lonely people who discovered that together they were no longer lonely, added Antonio, caressing Maria's blonde hair. Hans, now 28 years old and veteran of his own family, observed, "You taught us that family is built day by day, that true love is a choice renewed each morning." Greta, always the family philosopher, added, "And that different origins don't divide us. They enrich us. We are living proof that it's possible to preserve traditions while being citizens of the world." Joachim, with his characteristic practicality, laughed, "And that honest work and mutual respect build more than beautiful speeches or foolish prejudices." Rosa, always concerned with social justice, said, "You proved that true love knows no boundaries, not of nationality, nor of language, nor of tradition." Anna, the family artist, concluded with poetry in her voice, "You transformed, too, lonely melodies into a complete symphony." When night fell over the fields and the children retired, Antonio and Caterina slowly walked through the gardens she had planted over the years. German flowers, roses, daisies, tulips, coexisted harmoniously with jasmine, pitanga trees and flame trees, creating a unique perfume that perfectly symbolized their intertwined lives. "Do you have any regrets?" he asked, as he did every year on that special day. "Only one," she replied, and he was startled until she continued, smiling, "I should have looked for you sooner." "And you? Any regrets?" Antonio reflected on the question she returned to him. He thought of Rosa, whom he had loved and lost, of the pain that had brought him to that abandoned ranch, of the loneliness he had thought was his final destiny. "Regrets? None," he finally said. "Rosa taught me to love. You taught me it was possible to love again. Both were gifts that made me a better man." "And the future? What do you see when you look at our children, our grandchildren?" "I see continuation," replied Antonio, embracing her while they watched the stars that shone over their prosperous property. "I see that we built something greater than ourselves. Our grandchildren will grow up knowing that differences enrich, that love overcomes prejudices, that family is built with dedication and maintained with respect." "It will be our legacy," said Caterina softly. "A family that proved it was possible to unite different worlds without losing the soul of either. They walked in comfortable silence to the house, where the golden light of the windows awaited them like a warm embrace. At the gate, Antonio stopped and looked back one last time, seeing not just prosperous property, but the materialization of a dream he hadn't known he had. "Thank you," he said in a low voice. "For what?" "For choosing me, for building all this with us, for teaching me that sometimes the best things in life come when we least expect them, disguised as chance, but guided by providence." Katerina smiled, that smile that had conquered his heart slowly, like water that shapes stone with infinite patience. "Don't thank me. Thank destiny that put us in the same place at the right moment when we were both ready to begin again." They entered the house hand in hand, two souls who had found in each other not just companionship, but completeness. Behind them, the fields whispered in the night wind stories of love that transcend cultures, of families built on foundations of mutual respect, and of dreams that become reality when two people decide to build together something greater than their own solitudes. The full moon illuminated the Pereira property, blessing with its silver light a family that had proved it was possible to transform wounds into strengths, differences into riches, and two lonely hearts into a symphony of love that would echo through the generations.